So, welcome to everyone to our Wisconsin Immigrant Workers, Their Stories and Impact series. This is a three-part series. This is the second of three, looking at the many essential roles that immigrants play in our Wisconsin economy and society. The series is organized by our friends at Alverno College in partnership with UWM's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and UWM's Institute of World Affairs. My name is Doug Savage. I'm director of the Institute. And before we begin, I would invite you to look for an announcement of the final installment, which will focus on the role immigrants have played in healthcare, particularly during the COVID pandemic. That will be on May 12th. So, word on format. We will have a presentation followed by a Q&A as time permits. I would ask that you remain muted during the presentation and put any questions you might have in the chat, and then we can call on you, at which time, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, you would certainly be welcome to do that. Well, we're very fortunate today to have Ruth Conniff with us. She is editor of the Wisconsin Examiner, former editor-in-chief of the Progressive magazine. You may have seen her on CNN's Capital Gang, Good Morning America, C-SPAN, NPR, MSNBC, and other media outlets, or read her op-eds in publications like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, and not a bad resume, all told. Now, I would invite you to look forward eagerly, as we all are, to the publication of her book on the topic for tonight's presentation, entitled Milked: How an American Crisis Brought Together Midwestern Dairy Farmers and Mexican Workers, which is out in July of this year. So with that, Ruth Conniff, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So, well, thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm honored, and I think the program sounds really interesting. I got very interested in the role that particularly Mexican immigrant workers play in Wisconsin's dairy industry when I moved with my family to Oaxaca for a year shortly after Donald Trump was elected president. We decided to take our kids and go to Oaxaca, put them in school there, and spend some time away from the United States, get some perspective on our country, learn about a different culture. The kids learned Spanish amazingly quickly because they were thrown into the deep end in schools there. And while I was there, I read an article about Mexican workers returning to Mexico from the dairy farms of Wisconsin and Minnesota, where they make up a very large percentage of the labor force now. And things had gotten uglier since Trump's election, and people had decided to go back. So there was one family in particular that was profiled in the article that I read in the Wisconsin State Journal. And I called the reporter who did that article at the Center for Investigative Journalism in Wisconsin, and she put me in contact with that family. So I went down and visited them and became really interested in the story of their relationship with the farmer they had worked for almost 20 years. And just the long-term relationship between dairy farmers in our state and Mexican workers. So I have some slides. I thought I would just show you. The slides are really the people that I talked to for my book. And as I go through them, I'll tell you a little bit about the overview of the book itself. So I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see if I can do this right. I did it before and it worked. Shoot, I do want to show you my slide. Let me try again.
There you are.
Okay, great. Now I'm going to do this slide view here. Okay, sorry about that. So here's the book cover. And as Doug said, the title of the book is Milked: How an American Crisis Brought Together Midwestern Dairy Farmers and Mexican Workers. So fundamentally, this is a book about two groups of people who are under a lot of pressure from global economic forces that are beyond their control. One group is the dairy farmers in Wisconsin and Minnesota, who are experiencing an unprecedented crisis in farming. We in Wisconsin have been losing about 2 family farms per day, at least between 2010 and 2019. And it wavers a little bit, but we're still losing at least a farm a day. And this situation has been ongoing for a long time because of low milk prices and a volatile market, and enormous pressure on farmers to grow in order to keep up with the massive milk production of the larger farms. So the group of people that I interviewed and got to know in Western Wisconsin and Eastern Minnesota were running family farms, small operations with about 100 cows. And they had grown over the last 20 years or so to have as many as 1,000 cows. And in that process, they went from entirely family-run operations to hiring workers for the first time. And they had difficulty asking each other labor from people who lived near their farms. They would hire high school workers, they would work for a little while and then quit. It was hard, a lot of farmers told me, to find Americans who wanted to work 12-hour shifts, feeding cows, cleaning up manure, really hard, grueling work. And during this period, more and more on the farms, some of the large farmers were connecting with Mexican workers who were doing seasonal labor at Christmas tree farms in the area. And it became kind of a trend through word of mouth that people began hiring Mexican workers to work on their farms. And the Mexican workers, also Central Americans, but mostly Mexicans, were drawn to the year-round jobs where it wasn't just seasonal. And the farmers were really delighted that this solved a major problem for them in filling a labor void. So it is now the case that we have about 80% of the labor on Wisconsin dairy farms performed by immigrants, mostly from Mexico. My book opens with this guy, Stan Linder, who's on the left, or on my left, as you look at the picture. He is firing up his Ford Transit van to drive down 3,000 miles to the Mexican state of Veracruz to visit the families of his undocumented workers. And he's been making that trip over and over again for 20 years through a nonprofit group called Bridges, Puentes, which was started by a high school Spanish teacher in Alma, Wisconsin, named Sean Duval, who worked as a translator on area dairy farms. As more and more Spanish speakers were doing the work on dairy farms, she would come to the farms and help the farmers communicate with this new labor force. And she got the bright idea to start taking the farmers to Mexico to visit the families of their workers. And it was a transformative experience for the farmers, and they've been doing it every year since 2001. So I went along on one of these trips in 2019. And when Stan, this guy on the left, arrived in Zongolica in Veracruz, this small town in Veracruz, he was met and welcomed very warmly by 2 women, Blanca Hernandez and Fatima Chipotle, who knew him well. I'd gotten to know him over the years. They brought an entire bottle of tequila, and Stan and his granddaughter, who's sitting 2 seats to his left, finished the entire bottle of tequila and just had a blast with these people. And it was really fun and funny to see them getting together and just that they had this long-term relationship and they knew each other really well. The farmers who go on these trips are just blown away by the homes and businesses their workers have built with the money they made working in the farms in Wisconsin, Minnesota. And so the trip was largely a tour of those homes. Some of them were half built. They were being constructed by workers who were still back on the farm. It was during the polar vortex, and Stan made a call. He received a call on his cell phone when he was standing in the bright sun in the yard looking at one of his workers' half-built houses, and she was back on the farm. The trucks wouldn't start because it was so cold, and so they were working that out. They had sort of switched positions, and I thought that was really interesting. And you know, the businesses and the homes that people are building, here's another shot of that particular trip that I went on with the farmers and some of the workers they visited are really impressive. We saw a chain of cell phone stores that one worker had built after being in Wisconsin for about 20 years. We saw a tomato business that was thriving. We saw people who had multiple employees. They had sent back money to build their homes. All in all, in 2021, Mexican workers in the United States sent back $50 billion in remittances to their home country, which kept the economy going during the pandemic. The president of Mexico, AMLO, praised them as living heroes, and their contribution rivals petroleum exports from that country. So it's a huge economic story. Here's Stan bringing some of the items from back in Wisconsin that people wanted delivered to their family members in Mexico. In writing this book, what most interested me was discovering this unexpected friendship between the farmers and the Mexican workers. The farmers saw something that they recognized in the rural areas they visited in Veracruz, and that was a rural way of life that they feel themselves to be losing here in the United States. Chris Weisenbeck, one of the farmers I interviewed, when he first arrived in Mexico on the trip that he took, one of the early trips, he saw a whole bunch of neighbors all unloading cement and helping lay the foundation for a house in San Juan Texhuacan, the little village there in the mountains of Veracruz. And he said it was like something out of his childhood in rural Wisconsin in the 1960s. And his summary quote was, "Small town Mexico, small town USA, same thing." John Rosenau, who's been involved in Bridges Puentes for a long time and has gone on every trip, said it's an agrarian way of life, what he saw there. They find farm work honorable, where most people in this country would take public assistance before they would work on a farm. So that sense of connection between these two groups of rural people is really strong, and it's interesting. In the rural Midwest, it's no secret that there is this huge farm crisis. As I mentioned, we've been losing 1 to 2 dairy farms a day. You no longer see black and white Holstein cows dotting the fields as you drive the rural highways in Wisconsin like you used to. Most of the cows have moved indoors into big buildings in large operations. And one startling statistic is that even as the number of dairy herds has declined by more than half in Wisconsin over the last decade, it dropped from about 16,000 herds in 2004 to just over 7,000 in 2020. According to the state agriculture department, the number of cows has stayed the same at about 1.2 million. So there are just fewer herds with fewer giant herds, even as these dairy farms are going under. Another indicator of this massive shift and crisis is that our State Department of Ag set up a farmer suicide hotline. Mental health funding for farmers is a hot topic in the Capitol. Are you guys all looking at my email inbox here as I am? I don't know why that happened. The Ag Department is offering group counseling and seminars on marriage strain, and seminars called Unexpected Tomorrows for farmers. So that is a very intense crisis that we are living through right now. At the same time, there is the so-called border crisis in the United States. And what's missing from a lot of the discussion of immigration is the degree to which US industries, including food service, hospitality, construction, and especially agriculture, are dependent on immigrant labor. So this is a picture from a Voces de la Frontera rally during the debate over Trump's wall and funding for it. Let me see if I can make my email go away. Ugh, no, I can't. Sorry about that. 2/3 of workers in California, our biggest ag state, are immigrants. 1 in 5 essential workers during the pandemic was an immigrant. 80% of work on Wisconsin dairy farms, as I mentioned, is now performed mostly by undocumented immigrants. The reason most people who are working on farms in Wisconsin are undocumented is that there is no visa program for year-round low-skilled labor in the United States. They simply can't get a legal visa for the kind of work you do on a dairy farm, which is not seasonal. Under the Bracero program between 1942 and 1964, 5 million Mexican laborers came to the United States to work in agriculture, the largest contract labor program in US history. This was a program that was intended to fill a temporary work shortage during World War II. And Mexicans who were willing to work long hours for low pay were supposed to be protected by various safeguards, including prevailing wages and provisions for adequate housing and food, although there was still a lot of exploitation and abuse. But In 1952, Congress made it a felony to knowingly conceal, harbor, or shield an illegal immigrant. And they wrote in a proviso that allowed employers to continue to employ undocumented immigrants without running afoul of that law. And around the same time, Congress established the H-2B visa program, allowing migrant workers to perform seasonal labor on US farms. But there's still this gap. There's no visa for the year-round workers. And meanwhile, life has gotten a lot harder for immigrants in the United States. Here in Wisconsin, our legislature took away driver's licenses from undocumented people, anyone who can't prove that they're legally here, in 2007. We're one of 14 states that doesn't allow non-legal residents to drive. So that was a major driving force for people who left around that time. Louisa Tippole is the woman that I first met when I read the article about the workers who were going back to Mexico. She was in Veracruz in 2017 in San Juan, Texarkana. After I read that local news story about her and her family returning, I went to the town and I saw the same Honda pickup truck that her husband had driven all the way back home from a Wisconsin dairy farm parked on the street. And I took a tour of their home that they had built there up in the mountains with this incredible vista of the mountains around them. They're very typical in that hundreds of people from their town have migrated to work on dairy farms in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Locals estimate that about 500 people among the town's 2,000 residents were currently living on the farms in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And all over town, you can see the half-built houses that they're sending money home to build a little bit at a time. Not able to get bank loans, so paying cash, building as much as they can, and then waiting until they have more cash to build the next level. It's very notable, the sort of big grand looking cement houses, some painted bright colors, some with stars stamped into their facades, all over town, many unfinished. So the point of this tale is that, like a lot of Mexican farm workers, Louisa Tippole, although she spent 2 decades living and working in the United States, was never here to pursue the American dream. She was, like a lot of Mexican farm workers, part of a pattern of circular migration that's been in presence since before that Bracero program. And if you're interested in this phenomenon, there is a really interesting research paper called Why Border Enforcement Backfired by Professor Douglas Massey, who spent many years studying immigration patterns in the United States. And he argues that beefed up border enforcement actually had the unintended consequence of causing many more Mexican immigrants to stay and settle in the United States, increasing their numbers from 3 million to 12 million in the period that he studies between the late 60s and early 2000s. So Mexican workers now spend many more years working and living in the United States and still dream of going back, but it just takes longer to save up enough money to do it. And there is a lecture by Massey on YouTube that you can watch that has a really fascinating description of the deliberate policy decision to create what he calls a moral panic over immigration, beef up border enforcement, commit more money to border enforcement, leading to more apprehensions because there was more manpower for the apprehensions, and then helping to drive the narrative about an invasion that requires even more punitive measures. Meanwhile, the same people continue to go back and cross the border, whether legally or illegally, to do jobs here. So I think it's a very helpful analysis to understand a little bit about what's wrong with the way that we look at immigration. Fatima Chipotle is the woman pictured here. I actually accidentally advanced to her in my slides. She built this papeleria right across the street from the local school with the money that she earned working on a dairy farm in Minnesota. And she still talks to her former employer, a dairy farmer in Minnesota. I actually talked to him from her cell phone while I was visiting her. And he loves her. He gave her a painting of cows to remember him by when she went back, with this very warm message in broken Spanish on the back, and talked a lot about how it was a lifesaver for him to hire her and her sister who came to work for him.
Excuse me, Ruth. Your slides got stuck at the cows in the field in Wisconsin. I wonder if you want to unshare and reshare. So we may have missed a couple.
I was looking at a different, yeah, I have, my computer sometimes leaps into this strange mode. So let me try again. So did you see, here, I'll start again. I'll just advance.
Yes, we saw, and then we saw about 2 past that.
This Stan, you saw this group shot,
Yes,
saw Stan delivering items.
yes, that's where we stopped. Now
Okay.
we're good.
This is the immigration protest.
Now you're good.
This is Louisa Tippole, who I was talking about. She was the first person that I read about coming back to Mexico. And she's standing in her yard here. So you can see this town where she lives, San Juan Texocan, is literally touched by these clouds in the mountains. It's really beautiful. And she talked about how life was better for her kids. Her kids were born in Wisconsin, went to Wisconsin schools, and went back with her when they were very young elementary school students. And their classmates made fun of them because they spoke Spanish with a Wisconsin accent. So they were having a little trouble adjusting, but their teachers were nice. And what she said was really wonderful for them about being back at home in Mexico was that their cousins were there. And when they had lived on the farm in Wisconsin, in addition to facing some racism and also fear that their parents would be deported and ripped away from them, the police would pulled over their dad a couple of times and they were really scared by that. They were just with family. They grow a lot of their own food. They have chickens. She felt like they were healthier. And she felt like in Wisconsin, they were always on their tablets and computers and they really couldn't get to play with friends because living on the farm, they were more isolated, and also because their parents couldn't drive without fear of deportation. So she felt overall life was better. They were freer. A lot of people said that over and over to me. We just feel freer here. But it's hard to find a family supporting job in their area. And the last I heard, she had actually come back to the United States, is working on a dairy farm again. And her husband was driving a taxi in that little village when I visited them. So, you know, they're in this unstable economic situation where they're constantly going back and forth. This is Fatima Chipotle, who I was talking about, whose farmer was so grateful for her help and who opened this papeleria with the money that she made. She saved up for many years working in the United States. A taxi driver who drove me up the mountain from Zongolica to San Juan Texocan said, as he was driving me, "Excuse me, I don't want to offend you, but why do Americans say ugly things about Mexicans? We just come there to work, and Americans don't seem to want these jobs." So people were very conscious of the political rhetoric here and what was being said, and yet at the same time, there was this continuing relationship that has just been going on for decades. And you know, as I said, 500 of the 2,000 residents of this town come to do stints on the dairy farms. They've built specific relationships, this community and these specific communities in Wisconsin and Minnesota, where people come. And so that connection between those individual farms and the workers and the workers' family members and friends goes on today. This is Blanca, who I mentioned earlier, and her brother and sister, who also live in that area. And Blanca worked for many years. She was the one who brought the bottle of tequila to Stan, worked for many years in the United States. This is John Rosenau looking at a house that's being built for one of his workers who was still up working on his farm at the time. He's visiting the family members, the parents. These are the parents of one of his workers, Marco. A PBS film crew from Frontline followed us around for part of this trip in 2019, and they showed the interview with these folks and with John Rosenau afterwards. And this was the poorest family of the families that we visited. They burn wood and make charcoal basically for a living, and a truck comes by and picks up the charcoal. Marco, who is working on John Rosenau's farm, is a really energetic, friendly young man. In the last couple of years has finished paying for a new house for his parents, so they no longer live in this house. He's built them a house, and he's built himself a house, and he plans to go back in the next couple of years. So here's a typical shot from the countryside around the farms that I visited. It is a strange fact of life that in much of rural Wisconsin, the same farmers who love their Mexican workers and felt pretty outraged about the anti-Mexican comments that Donald Trump made when he called them rapists and criminals, also voted for Trump, mostly voted for Trump twice. And to understand that, you have to understand how NAFTA hurt these farmers and how abandoned they feel. by both political parties. And those divisions are obviously getting worse. The farmers that I spoke with dismissed a lot of the bad things that Trump said, and Doug and I started talking about this before we started here, sort of tuned out some of the uglier things he said, acknowledged they didn't really like his grandstanding or his sort of bullying talk, but we're still hoping that he was going to shake up a system that they felt had done very, very little for them. And they have reason to feel that way, you know, given the level of crisis that's going on and the sort of determination of everybody in Washington really to continue to support big ag and not to directly address the problem of no price supports and just, you know, the live and let die ethic that actually Trump's ag secretary repeated, which was the height of the farm crisis. He came to Wisconsin for the World Dairy Expo and said, you know, the big get bigger and the small go out. So, you know, they did not actually get a huge amount of help from Donald Trump, but that, you know, that sort of congenital republicanism, and I think also just the hope that an outsider would shake up the system continues. This is Carrie Schultz. She is a member of a Lutheran congregation in Minnesota, and although she is not herself a farmer, she got to be really close friends with some of the farm workers in her area who joined her church. And on our trip, she decided to come along. She had heard about the trip to visit the family members of these folks that she had befriended. And she, in this shot, is visiting a restaurant owned by the parents of one of the farm workers that she got to be friends with. And they gave her this skirt and traditional blouse. And there was a very sweet speech that they made to her, the mother of the young man that she had befriended, saying that Carrie was like a mother to her son and a grandmother to the grandchildren that she had never met. And everybody got teary-eyed. But this connection, I think this Bridges Puentes program and this connection between these two groups of people is very hopeful. So there is more at stake here than the pretty landscape and red barns. In my book, I get into the way that monopolies are taking over our food system and the environmental impact of giant farms, including unsafe drinking water. And the pandemic, which really exposed the vulnerability of our food system. If you remember when meat processing plants closed across the country, including in Green Bay, with a largely immigrant workforce and a COVID outbreak that left farmers euthanizing their animals because they had nowhere to take them to be processed. And there are fewer, because of consolidation and vertical integration, there are fewer processors than ever. So as part of my book, I drove down to Kentucky and visited Wendell Berry, who's sort of the poet and essayist and writer who's a spokesman really for a kind of agrarian life that is all but extinct now in this country. And his daughter, Mary Berry, runs a center that has been working on restoring local food processing in Kentucky in their area. So because she had created this program to help support small scale farming and a local food system, she was able to bring beef into West St. Louis during the pandemic. It was the only meat that got into West St. Louis during the pandemic in that time, and is continuing to help market beef raised by small farmers and working on restoring a local food chain, which is interesting work. This, if you haven't visited it, it's worth checking out. This is Fair Oaks Farms, which is kind of a factory farm funland, the largest dairy farm in America. It's located in Indiana. There are 35,000 cows there, and it is truly a dystopian view of the future of massive scale farming. There's a robotic dairy that has no people working in it. There are 9,000 cows moving through these automated gates in this strange cement area. You can watch it from what looks like an air traffic control tower. If a cow goes through the wrong gate, a worker in the control tower gets an iPhone alert and goes down to help. So, but this tourist attraction, which was started by Mike McCloskey, who's one of the largest dairy farmers in the United States and the founder of Fairlife Milk, which is the ultra filtered milk now owned by Coca-Cola. It has Smithsonian level exhibits to try to promote the idea that massive scale farming is the answer to ecological problems and feeding the world. And it's a pretty effective pretty compelling set of exhibits. You can get on a little van with pigs on it and go see their whole pig operation. You get on a van with cows on it and see their cow operation. And they have an exhibit that explains sort of the problem of keeping everybody fed in the rapidly expanding population on the earth, and sort of make this argument that we've got to maximize our use of soil and land. And of course, there's a significant pushback to that by people like researchers at the Small Planet Institute, which I quote in my book, who talk about the fact that we're losing 25 million acres of cropland each year through severe erosion. Synthetic fertilizer is causing acidification of the soil and depleting it of microbial diversity. We have polluted drinking water here in Wisconsin. It's become a big problem because of manure runoff. There are a variety of different problems. Super weeds that are resistant to treatment because of herbicides. So the answer really can't be that we need bigger and bigger and bigger operations. And interestingly, Mike McCloskey, the Fair Oaks founder, says that one of his attributes that made him successful is his fluency in Spanish. His parents are from Puerto Rico, and his relationship with his immigrant workforce. But he took a hit in 2019. There was a big scandal when some undercover animal rights operatives took film of animals being abused at the farm, and Coke discontinued its relationship with Fairlife. So that was a little bit of a setback for this kind of greenwashing, really, operation that he's. And then finally, in my book, I end with this chapter on sort of what does it all mean? How do we want to live? And I talked to an economist named Luis Rey, who grew up in Oaxaca. He came from a Zapotec-speaking village. He was the first member of his family to go to college, and went on to get his PhD and become an economist. And he tells an anecdote about a US economist who visited Oaxaca and went to villages and declared excitedly to Ray that he had discovered the root cause of poverty in Oaxaca, which was a lack of ambition in the people, because he had interviewed shopkeepers and he had asked them, what are your dreams? Do you want to have 2 shops? Do you want to have the biggest store in town? And the shopkeepers that he talked to said, no, they wanted to continue to live their life the way they were. They wanted to close early. They wanted to have, a good relationship with their neighbors, and that it would be viewed as greedy if they wanted to get too big and push other people out of business. And Ray sort of turned this critique of the US economist on its head and talks about how we need to have a more humane and sustainable way of living, to allow people to make a living without sacrificing everything, to walk across the border, to get off the frantic treadmill that's propelled by global capitalism. And I found that a very compelling story and kind of a good summary, both for the farmers who I interviewed, who are chasing this get big or get out model that is making their lives really hard. For urbanites too, who were part of the Great Resignation during the pandemic and are looking for a more balanced life. And certainly for the Mexican farm workers I talked to, who have been here for 10 or 20 years, saving up money and waiting to go back home to their families so their real lives can really begin. So, economic models that allow for a more local economy, a more sustainable way of life, I think are of great interest to rural people in both Mexico and the United States. And most of all, I think the message of my book is we have more in common than we realize. And that could get us somewhere. So that is my presentation. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much. And I would invite our audience members to drop your questions into the chat. And I'll start out with one if I could, while people are entering theirs. Could you talk a little bit about how some of these original relationships got started? I mean, in some of the more abusive situations, there are brokers in between the people benefiting from the labor and the workers themselves. Doesn't sound like that's the case here. I mean, how do these people end up in Wisconsin?
Well, there are a variety of different answers to that, but I think mostly it's word of mouth. So for the people that I talked to, there were some big farms and they probably did use brokers. There was, John Rosenau said when he was first looking for workers on his farm, he saw an ad in the back of Horde's Dairyman, and it was something called Amigos Incorporated, which is probably one of the brokers that you're talking about. And he called the number, and a worker arrived on his farm, and he worked there for a while and then moved on. But over time, what a lot of the farmers commented to me was that when people got ready to go back to Mexico, they would arrange a replacement. So a son or a nephew or, you know, somebody else in the family or friend would come up and would be trained by the person who was working there. So the language gap became less of a problem for the farmers, partly because they had offshored the training to the workers. And it was really very much the topic of my book is very much the relationship between these individual areas in Wisconsin and Minnesota and these specific towns. So that it just has become a pipeline of workers, and they don't need an intermediary.
That's great. Well, and given the significance of the agricultural economy, is there any serious political movement to address this obvious gap of not having year-round visas for people doing this work?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that. And it seems to me that it ought to be achievable because the fairly conservative big farm groups that lobby on behalf of farmers are interested. I mean, people like Mike McCloskey is a large immigrant labor force. He was shortlisted to be Trump's ag secretary, by the way. So there's definitely some muscle, you know, in a bipartisan way, and it ought to be achievable. The problem is, you know, what does that really look like? And is it a guest worker program in which the employers actually become almost like immigration officials themselves? They hold on to the paperwork, there's less mobility. So if you talk to immigrant rights activists, they're not always fans of the particular solutions that are being proposed. But there has been in Wisconsin a very interesting alliance between dairy farmers and Voces de la Frontera and other immigrant rights activists who have, you know, they put together the Day Without Latinos rally. There was a big rally specifically about restoring driver's licenses and improving conditions for immigrants, in which both farmers and workers participated. And actually, because of that coalition between the farmers and the immigrant rights activists, there was a plan for these mass walkouts in which there was a skeletal crew that took care of the farms so that the farmers didn't have to worry that the cows wouldn't be milked, and at the same time, you know, they could participate in this political action. So I do think that there's interesting, fruitful coalition work being done.
Well, that's great. Well, any other questions, please feel free to put them in. If not, I'll just keep firing away, and we don't want that. So
I think there's some in the chat unless they're just directed at me. About how my slides were messed up. You have a number for the number of workers representing 80% of labor? I don't have a number. That is was reported by the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and I've seen it repeated over and over again. And I don't know, you know, that's a tally that somebody did. Now, of course, the workers who come to work on these farms often do have fake papers, and the farmers take kind of a don't ask, don't tell approach. They look at these fake papers. Everybody knows there's no visa that makes it actually legal to be here and do low skilled work. And, you know, it's just kind of it's an unofficial arrangement. So I don't know, but the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel reported that, the Center for Investigative Reporting has reported it, and I don't know the actual raw number.
So Megan has a question. If you'd like to unmute and ask it, feel free.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, but I was wondering if you could speak to maybe the living conditions of these immigrants living on these farms, particularly thinking about if they're undocumented and what that means for healthcare. You know, if they don't make absolutely tons of money and they don't have health insurance, what do those things look like? What are their housing conditions? I've heard of some folks living like on trailers in the back of a farm and other folks living in nicer conditions. So if you can tell us anything you know about that.
Yeah. On John Rosenau's farm, there's a schoolhouse that's kind of a old concrete bunker style schoolhouse that's been divided into apartments for the workers. It doesn't look too bad. I visited a farmer, Blandina Hernandez, was living in a little house that was being provided by the farmer. She had a couple of kids. It seemed like a pretty decent space. She had lived in a trailer that she shared with her family plus another worker that was very, very difficult. And she had a son with autism who she would lock in the trailer because she was afraid that he would run out and get hit by a tractor. And that became absolutely unbearable. Through this group Bridges, she had somebody kind of intervene and help her find a better situation, which was the house that I saw when I visited her. She was also a victim of wage theft and went to the farmer to pick up her paycheck, and he said he had just decided not to pay her. And she was never able to resolve that. She had a couple of kids while she was working on the farm. The same farmer wouldn't give her any days off for that. And so, yes, there are some really unpleasant conditions. And then there are some situations that seem acceptable. They seem acceptable to the workers, given the options that they have. I mean, they're making between, the people that I talked to were making between $8 and $12 an hour. And the exchange rate made that a significant amount of money in Mexico. So they were living hand to mouth, no social life, just working all the time. And that is what they had come to do, to keep their heads down and to save up that money, send it back. And they were able to do something in their own communities that felt like wealth with that money, partly by not really living their lives while they were here. But those are some answers. I mean, those are some sort of overview answers. They're, I feel like the people that I interviewed for this book don't see themselves as victims. There is certainly some really horrific exploitation that goes on. I mean, there was a huge expose of teenagers in the egg industry who it was really slavery. They were being brought here and kept trapped to work on the farm. So I definitely acknowledge that goes on. The people that I interviewed for the book, I felt like saw themselves as entrepreneurial, and they were entrepreneurs. They were starting businesses, and they were felt proud of the work that they had done and what they had endured. But it was hard. I mean, they crossed the border illegally, some of them in the trunks of cars. It's really, really hard.
Thank you.
Sergio, you have a question.
Yeah, Ruth, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I'm glad that you answered the last question here, talking a little bit about the other side of the coin. If I would have walked away from this presentation, I might have thought that the majority of the relationships between workers and employers was relatively sunny. But of course, studies have shown that most living situations and working conditions for dairy workers across the state are functionally exploitative. And so, one of the questions I have, of course, is how we can think of this not just at the big picture kind of world systems, the issues of NAFTA and globalization that are at issue here, but also the fact that these are at their heart employer-employee relationships. And for me, the reference point that I think about, I'm working on a book on Latinos in Wisconsin going across the 20th century. And this isn't the first time that rural employers have looked to Mexican descent workers, of course, to fill wage gaps, right? Or to fill labor gaps. Going back to the bracero program, which you mentioned, under 10,000 braceros came to Wisconsin in the 1940s. And the reason that employers stopped using braceros in Wisconsin was because the structures in place were much too rigorous for them to meet the living and working conditions. They preferred to hire Texas Mexican workers who they could exploit more easily. And so really the story throughout the 1950s is the story of exploitation. And so I'm wondering here, when you talk about rural farm workers who seem to be left with no choice, at the end of the day, they still make the decision to employ these workers, and the conditions that they impose are their conditions. I mean, they are structured by globalization, but at the end of the day, they're responsible for the wages they pay, and they're responsible for the recruitment. So if we step away and kind of think not just about those world conditions issues, but the issues at hand in rural Wisconsin, what's the story that we should be thinking about these relations between workers and their employers?
Well, I think what's really interesting to me is that there are long-term relationships between these families, and that this is possibly a moment in history that's going out now. It's not going to exist anymore. But the people that I'm talking about are people who didn't have any employees before they hired Mexican workers for the first time. And really, like, it isn't really the sort of the story of exploitation sort of on the, it's not what I expected, because what I found were people who had, pairs of families that had a long-term relationship and who had done hard physical labor all of their lives, both groups of people, and were working side by side. They were not in a hierarchical structure where somebody's sitting in an office and the other person is doing the physical labor. They were in the barn together. And also, it's a moment in history where rural places, and it's more extreme in Mexico when you visit and you see like all of the working age adults are gone in a town, you see elderly people and little kids. But rural areas in the United States are also seeing a huge out-migration, right? Sort of the death of rural areas, and actually have been saved by younger immigrants who have come in and made, for example, the schools in Arcadia, which are 75% Spanish speakers, would be closed now because of rural depopulation. So really kind of a whole mix of things is going on there. But the thing that I'm focused on that I find kind of interesting is like, here are these agrarian people, really hardworking people who are just trying to make their way, and they have been thrown together, and they have real relationships and a real sense of being in the same boat in some way. And I think that is just it's kind of a different view of what's going on. So that's what interested me about it. And the stories so my book is organized into biographical chapters, and it alternates between sort of the life stories of the farmers and the workers. And then there's a chapter just on Arcadia. But this is just it's sort of this historical moment that's really kind of fascinating. So that's how I view it. I'm interested in the sort of the life stories of the people.
Well, one of the things that, of course, precipitated the workers coming from elsewhere is the lack of a domestic workforce. And, you hear a lot about, there was a time when the kids in the family went into the barn and worked. And now, what is driving the need for outside people to come in? Is it just the scale is such that nobody can have that many kids in their family? Or is it such that the local people just don't want to do that work anymore?
Well, the people are having fewer kids. Absolutely, that's part of it. I mean, Chris Weisenbeck, one of the farmers I interviewed, talks about that. And he's like, you want to see what's happened to the family farm? My grandfather had 13 kids. His father had, as many. I have 2 kids. He does want his 2 kids to inherit the farm. But it's pretty hard to tell your kids that your future should be in farming, given the situation that farmers are in this state, unless you're talking about, being on that huge, giant scale, which, didn't used to be what we had in Wisconsin. So yes, people are leaving, young people are seeing opportunity elsewhere, and farms are just disappearing. People are selling land that's been in their families for 100 years. And those who are hanging on are scaling up, because that is the way that you stay in business, because milk prices have been so low, the market is so volatile. And in scaling up, they absolutely have to have employees, because they can't cover the 1,000-cow farms that they're creating. So that's kind of in that spot of transition is where, my book is centered, not the mega farms, like not the 8,000-cow farm that's trying to come into Green Bay and get a variance so that they can do what local people are afraid is going to pollute the water, but people who have gone from 50, 100 cows up to 300 cows and then 500 cows, but not yet over 10,000, which is really where things are going.
And you've gotten to know these families pretty intimately, it sounds like. Did you find many kids going into farming, or is that something that just doesn't happen much anymore?
The majority of people that I talked to had kids who did not go into farming. There were a couple of families, and they're trying to figure out how to make a living by doing a combination of farming and something else. Somebody has a job as a teacher that has health insurance, or they're having a hobby farm, but they're doing something else to make money, because it's a really hard way to make a living in.
Right. Well, we want to be respectful of your time. I know you've got another commitment, but if you would just leave us with what we should think about when we're pushing our cart around Pick and Save, and we take that carton of milk out of the cooler and put it into our cart.
You know, I really think we all need to think about buying local food. I really think that that's going to be the answer to the environmental crisis and the economic crisis, and just the crisis of how do we have a more livable scale world. So Organic Valley, which is started in Wisconsin, is a really big, successful model of trying to allow people to make a living in farming. So I would think about that. And I think, you know, the slogan of the immigrant rights rally in the Capitol a couple of years ago, which was "Got milk, not without immigrants," that it is absolutely an immigrant labor force that's producing our milk in Wisconsin. And it is absurd to have a, you know, a sense of fear or invasion, or, you know, for folks who are really holding our economy together, just holding it together, and need to be able to drive, need to be able to live a more livable life. So, I mean, I think remembering that they're the ones that produce that food is really important too.
Well, thank you very much. And to our audience, I would remind you to look out for a notice of our May 12th, third and final installment in this series. And to the extent that we can digitally and virtually, why don't we give a round of applause to Ruth Conniff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, so very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to the book.